Hi, we're now live. Welcome to the ninth Literacy Research Association Research to Practice show. Today we have a phenomenal panel, and we are going to discuss critical race theory and how that plays out in the classroom and in ed policy and in research in general, with a big focus on what does this mean for the classroom teachers. This is, in the Research to Practice shows, we really try to take the information that, and all the great discussions that we're having inside of academia and truly apply them to classroom settings. So before we get started, why don't we just go through and introduce ourselves, and we'll start all the way on the left with Alina, or is it Elena?
Alina.
Alina.
Nice to meet you. Yeah. My name is Alina Adani Pruitt. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Texas at Austin in Language and Literacy Studies. I'm a student of Dr. Allison Skerritt's, and I'm eager to get in on the conversation about race and racial power and how they're constructed and represented. Nice to meet you all.
Allison?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Allison Skerritt. I'm an associate professor in Language and Literacy Studies, also at the University of Texas at Austin. I do work in English education, adolescents literacy practices, focusing particularly on youth from racially, culturally, and linguistically diverse backgrounds. And I'm happy to be here for the conversation.
Wonderful. David?
David Kirkland, Associate Professor of English and Urban Education. I'm also happy to be here for the conversation.
Judd?
I'm Judd Lauder, Assistant Professor of English Education at the University of Tennessee, the other UT, the real UT.
And as our discussant, we have Dr. Kathy Hinchman, so if you could introduce yourself, please.
Sure. I'm a professor at Syracuse University, and I've written some self-critical analyses of my own positionalities in this area, but as the discussant, I'm perfectly happy to confer to our speakers who've done lots more work in this area, so when we get to the discussion, we'll see how we can make it more of an exchange among all of us, because we've all experienced the raised world, I think, in different ways. I should also say I'm in the middle of teaching a practicum, and I just took on a job as Associate Dean in the past couple of weeks, so, if I start babbling, just tell me to hit my mute button.
I try that with my dean all the time. And I'm Greg McVeary. I'm the host for this month's show. I am an assistant professor at Southern Connecticut State University. Did I get that right backwards? No, yeah, I got that backwards. Associate professor at Connecticut State University. And so I just want to start us off, if we could all, and feel free to jump in at any time with no big order. If I'm in my first year of teaching class, and this is my first exposure to this EDU 100. How do I define critical race theory, and why would it be important to me as a classroom teacher? Mm-hmm. Anyone can jump in on that.
Well, I'll take a stab at
Thank you.
starting. Certainly, one of the tenets of critical race theory being that race is endemic and pervasive, or race and racism in racially diverse or racially stratified societies, means that it's critical, really, for teachers to understand race and racism and how that functions in society and personal and social life, and to be able to use and apply racial knowledge or understandings of race and racism in terms of how they think about teaching, in terms of how they think about their students, their curriculum and their instructional practices. And so I think one important thing to understand from the onset is that whether or not we consciously think or read or learn about race and racism and how race functions in society, we are constantly working from assumptions that may be unexamined. We all are racialized people and lead racialized lives, and so that's, I think, why it's so important for teachers to grasp those understandings and begin to think about how and why that's important for teaching. I'll let others jump in.
Yeah, I want to jump in, and I want to answer the question in two ways. First, I want to answer the question from a pragmatic dimension. One, in terms of the cosmology, the demographics of U.S. schools are changing tremendously, and it's projected that the U.S. schools will be majority-minority students in about 50 years, which means that in the teaching population will be continuously majority white and female, which means that we need a type of racial sensitivity, when we think about teaching in context between teachers, who are predominantly white, who have, a cultural position that gives them some proximity to privilege, and, the narratives of students, who come from backgrounds that, are likely to be different than theirs. So in this conversation, race matters. We've seen in the research and we've seen in the scholarship, starting in the 1970s, but certainly in the 1980s, people who wanted to define, the sociological dimensions of inequity in society as diminishing, in terms of race. So you get William Julius Wilson's The Declining Significance of Race around 1991-92. Cornel West writes that race matters. So in this vein, critical race theory for teachers suggests, and I think in some ways it insists, that race matters in all conversations of institutional and structural practice where outcomes of justice and injustice, are, possible consequences. So I think that just in terms of the conversation in education, the first reason to think about race and critical race theory is because race has been a continuing conversation and will be increasingly a continuing conversation in education. The other reason is that critical race theory at this moment in American society, where we have, discourses of, neoliberalism and post-race, society, suggests that we have to move past race, this type of color blindness. And that type of color blindness, leaves in place a variety of, structural and institutional barriers, that create a level of dissonance between, people who occupy, racial subjectivities outside of the privileged, skin. Which means that we begin to define and explain, success on terms that delete race from the conversation. What critical race theory says that we can't delete race from the conversation, and to do so would only leave us with the same type of, structural inequalities that have defined things like achievement along racial lines.
Great response from both of you. And David, you brought up this idea of narratives and how there's a dominant narrative. After just recently finishing your book and Allison reading some of your work and some of the citations that people have posted, there's this, can we all explain this concept of what do we mean by the importance of a counter-narrative, and how do we explore counter-narratives, and how would you possibly see those playing out? What makes, unpack that term for the audience, a counter-narrative.
So the first thing, oh, David, you want to go ahead?
No, please,
yeah,
please.
hop on in, John.
One thing I want to say about your previous question, the Ed 100, what does that teacher need to know? Critical race theory might not be immediately approachable to them because they're learning, they're teachers, right? But things like culturally relevant pedagogy and current conceptions of multicultural education, current conceptions of how do we respond to these neoliberal forces that David is talking about, that's where the teacher is going to see the importance of critical race theory. Critical race theory provides you a framework for analysis, but then when it gets taken and used to develop, these other ideas about pedagogy, about teaching, that's where a teacher is going to see them. That's where they're going to begin to engage these ideas like racism is endemic, or it's important. The use of voice, the narrative of voice is important. For the question about narrative, I would go back a little bit historically.
Okay.
100 years ago, in a court case, there was this idea that you had two different sides, and they were going to look at the facts, and a judge and a jury are going to decide the exact same thing based on a set of facts. Well, this idea came about in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s called critical legal studies, which first said, you know what, that's not what this is. The courtroom is a place where two different sides are telling two different stories. And it's which story the jury likes better that wins. Now, fast forward a couple of decades, you get people who, in the fields of law, start looking at this and saying, this is important, but the piece that these people are missing that's important to us is race. The story that race has to tell in the courtroom is what's really important, and is what is leading to a whole collection of different outcomes for people who, identify or are identified as by different races. So there's kind of a historical piece around where narrative comes from. So then you get this school of critical race theory coming out of the work of Derek Bell and some of his students, who are looking at, okay, what is the importance, what is the place of narrative in a courtroom? And then we get Ladson, Billings, and Tate, who hop on from the education side and say, okay, this has a lot to say about education. So what are the stories that are not being told? What are the stories that are being marginalized? What are the stories that are being whitewashed? Everything is a story. Research is a story. The courtroom is a story. Education is a story. So the idea of narrative is a pretty expansive one. I don't know if somebody else wants to jump in at some point, but the important part between a counter narrative is that there is a master narrative. There is a grand narrative. That's the matrix we live in. Those are the things we are taught. Those are the things that we grow up believing are true. And then the counter narratives are ones that challenge the master narrative.
Yeah. And I would also argue, and I want to try to put it in, put this in perspective. I'll be quick. There's an African proverb that says, until the lion learns to write history, the story of the jungle will forever glorify its hunter. And that means that the master narrative has consequences. And the consequences is this. The consequences is that it erases, the story and the realities of people who can't tell their own story. So counter storytelling, it interrupts a Western positivistic, notion about how to go about making truth and producing knowledge by giving people, who haven't historically had opportunities to tell, history or to write history on their terms, a way to not only write history but name one's own reality.
And I would add to that in everyday classrooms for a first-year teacher, that this is an attainable part of everyday curriculum, and that when students are invited to tell their own, to speak their own reality. And I think Delgado touches on this quite a bit, that counter narratives can be part of a writing curriculum, a reading curriculum that engages students in literacy practices that draw on their own language, their own linguistic repertoires, their own racial knowledge, their own racial understanding, their cultural experiences, the depth and beauty of what they have to offer. And narratives can be used to teach. This can be the backbone of a reading writing workshop, where students are engaging in editing and in composition and in publication, and that can be a very powerful thing. And there have been quite a few studies that show that, and show even step by step, suggestions on how to engage youth of color in that way. And so it can be, I think, a relatively hopeful pursuit for first-year teachers or for beginning teachers who would otherwise maybe be daunted by this concept or by this approach, because it does seem a bit, or at least in our context, that counter narratives are almost what's the word, like disobedient, right? Like, and I mean, I think Mignolo calls it that. There's you're familiar, of course, with Mignolo from Duke, who talks about this idea of epistemic disobedience, and that it can be so frightening, I think, for first-year teachers, but it's quite attainable.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up a little bit if we could. Judd, you mentioned some ideas about first-year teachers who may understand critical race theory as a heuristic, in a sense, for understanding the societal structures, schooling structures, and what have you, but may feel more comfortable or equipped with an approach that might be called a culturally responsive approach or a multicultural education approach. And I wanted us, and I know that Kathy, you had, I think it was you had sort of edited one of the first questions we were asked to prepare around, in terms of how might critical race theory be similar to or different from approaches to multicultural education or what have you. And I think it's so important for us to tease that out as scholars and as teachers. When we say multicultural education or culturally responsive education versus racial literacy instruction or critical race theory, what does that mean and what does that imply? And when we talk about teachers or maybe even teacher educators being more prepared or feeling more equipped to prepare teachers for multicultural education and culturally responsive pedagogy versus taking a critical race theory approach to their teaching, what does that imply? And so I would like us to, maybe not now, but at some point in our conversation, talk about what it means for critical race theory, not just as an analytic or heuristic tool, but also as having some potential for some curricular and instructional approaches in classrooms and for helping teachers and students develop some critical racial understandings that can be applied in education and in academic work as well.
Yeah, so let's follow this line of inquiry. What is the difference then, between multicultural education and using critical race theory as a curriculum, and then B, it seems like we're talking a lot about naming things and students' individual literacies and the sense of agency and social justice in the curriculum. So how does that play out in the curriculum? So how would people draw the distinction between that multicultural education class that everybody has to take versus applying a lens, a true critical lens of race theory into our practice?
I think that question also gets back to the master narrative and counter narrative idea. Mm-hmm. So Leonardo has a new book out, Race Frameworks. I don't know if you can see that. And he makes the case, I think it's, if you read through the histories of this, critical race theory coming into education in the late 80s, early 90s, because multicultural education was not radical enough. It was not militant enough. What critical race theorists were looking for was something bigger, something more active, something that wasn't just heroes and holidays, something different, something that maybe was there in the 60s and 70s and then got lost in the 80s for whatever historical, political, geopolitical, economic reasons, but a return to a real majuscule C critical theory. And if you call anything critical, with the majuscule C, you at some point are calling back to Marx, to the Frankfurt School, to this idea of taking apart the economics of the way we build our societies. That's one of the biggest master narratives that a lot of these counter narratives begin to speak back to, the way people are priced and assigned a dollar value, how in our foundational documents, some people are only worth 60% of what I'm worth, and I'm worth something more because I might own certain things. I don't know, that's the biggest master narrative that's out there. And then I think this idea that critical race theory is wanted to be and still could be a radical theory for change in education or in law or whatever field you're interested in.
Well, I'll say this, that part of the difference, at least one significant difference between multiculturalism, and critical race theory, both as a lens and theory around education and society, are the two things are different, right? Multiculturalism is concerned, at least it seems to want to be concerned with culture or a certain type of cultural pluralism, whereas critical race theory wants to be concerned with race, and the two things aren't the same, right? And I think it's important not to conflate culture and race in this conversation, because by conflating culture and race in the conversation, it does something, I think, in some ways to diminish, race and the significance of race, and it suggests in some ways that there are hierarchical cultures and under there are subcultures that don't necessarily, exist within, that space of race. And we know that there is a multicultural within the space of singular race, but there is also, the issue of race that takes its own type of precedence. Another thing that I want to say is this, is that when we look at critical race theory and how it emerged, we begin to see some differences too, right? I'm thankful of the Black feminist scholarship, particularly Black feminist scholarship, the 1980s, because it gave us things like intersectionality. It gave us things like a study of, masculinity. It gives us things like critical race theory. And that Black feminist scholarship seemed to want to be concerned with, how to answer questions in more complex ways. So we're not just talking about class as it matters. We're not just talking about age as it matters in isolation. We're not just talking about culture as it matters in isolation, but we're talking about how all of these things, how all of these flavors, in some ways interact to produce inequity inside of society. And so we have a layering, we have a complex webbing of concepts that create, inequity. And I think the power of critical race theory at its, I think at its most interesting, nexus is that it puts in place class, power, economics, all under, a critique of and a critique with, race and racism at its center.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think at the heart of it too, with critical race theory, one of the biggest components that sets it apart so drastically is the requirement to directly address white supremacy, the discomfort of addressing whiteness as an issue, as a power structure to I think as well the daily microaggressions that are present in the system, and that's often not as pleasant as it is, or it's portrayed, I think, in much more approachable ways, or less aggressive ways, perhaps. And so I think that the issue of white supremacy and tackling white supremacy is a big component of it.
I think it's really interesting to think about, applying this idea of master narratives, or maybe the whitewashing of particular narratives. If we want to maybe call ourselves as literacy scholars and teacher educators to task sometimes, right? And thinking about how, again, going back to this idea of our relative comfort and preparedness to talk about culture and even linguistic diversity to a particular extent, but perhaps not being as willing to inquire into a racial framework and what that means for teachers and for practices in schools. And so I think what is very exciting and important about critical race theory and what we're talking about tonight as literacy scholars is that it challenges us to think seriously about how we emphasize race and racial knowledge in our work as scholars and as teacher educators as well. So I think also, multicultural education has sometimes had that critical edge to it, that racial perspective, but for different social and political reasons, how that might not have been always taken up to the extent that other dimensions of multicultural education got taken up in popular discourse and in educational circles as well. My students are always surprised when I talk about Latson Billings, for instance, as a critical race theorist. They know her as a multicultural education scholar and as someone who does work in cultural responsive pedagogy. They read Dream Keepers and are comfortable with that and thinking about, cultural responsive practices. But when I introduce them to critical race theory and we talk about Latson Billings' work and read some of her work, they're very surprised to think about her as someone who really privileges a racial perspective in her work and how she thinks about education and schooling. And so I think we also have to be mindful in teacher education as well, how we are conceptualizing critical race theory vis-a-vis multicultural education and exposing our pre-service and in-service teachers to these ideas and what it could mean for their practices.
So how do we prepare in-service teachers for this kind of work? That's a question that came in from Twitter just now.
Well, I think, and I'll keep going since I seem to be kind of pressing the point. But I think an important first dimension of this work has to do with teachers doing this identity work. Also, us as teacher educators leading our pre-service teachers, in-service teachers to begin thinking about themselves as racialized being, whether they are Black, white, or whatever racial background they claim, and beginning to understand how race has shaped their experiences of privilege, disadvantage, the intersections of their racial identities with gender, social class, and the other dimensions that David was pointing out a few moments ago, and then starting to explore pedagogies that are promising for doing this work with their students. So identity work, I think, is the first step, and then thinking about practices such as critical inquiry, or beginning to use race to analyze their own schooling context, their own educational practices, how they think about and see their students, how their schooling contexts are positioning students, and so these exercises of beginning to think about and use race as an analytic tool for understanding themselves as teachers, for understanding their schooling context, the outcomes of their students, and then exploring some of the work that's been done on having students think about race, use race, explore race in school and society in their communities, as well as some work in literature studies that has to do with exploring text, using counter-narrative, some of the approaches that Alina was describing here.
So are we talking about a broadened sense of literacies? And I'll open this up to the floor. What do we mean when we're talking about that identity work, those kinds of narratives, especially in the face of, with the instructional shifts in the Common Core trying to push us away from doing any kind of true narrative work. Not totally, but there's definitely a large emphasis on writing where people don't really care what you think or feel. So how does this idea of a broadened sense of literacies fit into a critical race theory? And here comes the thunder.
Well, I would go as far as to say, that it broadened literacy in some ways. I think, is it Allison?
Yes.
I think Allison, made a good comment earlier, and there are a few other comments made around counter narrativizing, which is a type of literacy work, not only in terms of just like writing words, but also being able to write and edit worlds. And I think it's important. I think the most important piece about critical race theory is that, like critical theory, it suggests that education is not a neutral practice, but it's imbricated with power. And so in this way, we can think about critical race theory as an anti-racist agenda, anti-racist practice. So teachers who embrace critical race theory are also embracing that, project of anti-racism, which means that, it acknowledges the existence of racism within, a structure, within a practice, and it wants to, interrupt the existence of racism, through transformative means. So if this is broadening, by broadening the concept of literacy, that we can rewrite the world in ways that delete moments of racism, then that works for me. I think it's a beautiful way. Another thing that it does essentially is that it interrupts political constrictions that might narrow what we think about as literacy. So the literacies of people of color that have not always, been privileged in school definitions of literacy begin to get privileged as well. So in my book, I write about, people writing on skin and writing on walls and other practices of literacy, that don't necessarily make, the Common Core standard or the textbook. These practices become subject to use and subject to, deliberation that can make us smarter, that can, make us think about concerns that we haven't thought about previously, and can begin to get us to push that question about, how to make the world less racist.
Mm-hmm.
I think an important thing, too, I'm going to hold up a copy of David's book right here so everyone sees it. It's a fabulous book. To call back to what he was saying also, there's a difference between race and ethnicity and nationality and culture. The same way when we get to class, there's a difference between wealth and income and different measures of capital. The same way when we get to sexism and heterosexism, there's a difference between sex and gender identities and gender expression. You're teasing out these differences. That's, in the summers, I teach one of the, it's TPT 517. It's the Trends and Issues in Education. The entire first week is spent wrestling with identity. That is the foundational piece that any new teacher has to wrestle with. And the idea that you think you know who you are, but what's important is who your students say you are. That's who you are in the classroom, not who you say you are, not this individualistic idea, I get to decide who I am. But who does your context say you are? Who do your students say you are? If I walk into schools, I might look around and say, look at me, I'm a teacher. No, I walk into schools and I am labeled, I am a white male teacher. That's just what a lot of students are going to see in me. And I have to recognize that, I have to wrestle with that and know that it's 95% what they say I am and maybe 5% what I get to say I am. And then we can get to start teasing out the historical and theoretical and political constructions that all of these, to talk about grand narratives is to say these things are constructed. They're not natural, they're not normal, they're not biological. Each one of these has been constructed in a certain way. Each of these grand narratives has been constructed in a certain way to make sure some people receive privilege and some people do not. And if they are constructed, then we can take them apart. That's maybe the fifth week of the class. Like, okay, now I'm getting to this, now I might believe it, now I have a better understanding of what race and class and sex are. What do I do about it? And that's, Gladson Billings' pedagogy, cultural relevant pedagogy, always closes with this tenet of sociocultural consciousness and change. It's not about making everybody comfortable in the classroom. It's about changing the world, about changing your society, and that can happen. But that can happen.
So I'm seeing a lot of kind of convergence on this idea that literacy being an act of making meaning on the worlds or redesigning worlds and world stories, in this idea of through a sense of kind of agency and identity. And I'm on a kind of a little bit side note here, but it's interesting because you see this, these kind of definitions of literacy across so many other sociocultural viewpoints in literacy research, but you never, they don't seem to talk to each other in many ways. That were sort of siloed off. That was a random thought, but I'm going to get off that for a second, get us back to the conversation. Leaving the classroom for a little bit, how does this apply now more into educational policy? As we're seeing a lot of the claims, with the Vergara case, this is a civil rights issue, teacher evaluation and bad teachers, or the lower, the differences in test scores and achievement or opportunity gaps. That's the civil rights issue of this era. It seems the term civil rights issue itself, the term civil rights is being kind of uptaken as the master narrative in a sense. And I'm just wondering if there's how do we apply then critical race theory to a national or a policy level? If that made any sense, my ramblings.
That's a great question.
I think one of the foundational pieces I would suggest people read, and I won't go through the whole thing now, but Gladson Billings' 2006 presidential address at AERA laid out very specifically that we're not talking about achievement gaps, we're talking about achievement debts. And I put a little cartoon picture in the show notes that kind of gets at that in a maybe humorous way. But the policy is well, I don't know. Let someone else answer. I got to think about that one.
Allison, do you want to go?
I wanted to just I think just second in a sense what Judd just mentioned. I think Gladson Billings' piece is a key piece for teachers and other interested people who are interested in CRT to pick up and read and think about the education debt as opposed to the achievement gap. And so in terms of policy, understanding that we cannot think about educational solutions without also considering the larger political, economic, social, and other factors that are continuing to create disadvantage for students of color, for marginalized groups in the society, and that education policy cannot solve the large-scale problems that have this wide-ranging set of dimensions that are contributing to the educational outcomes that we're seeing for students of color in schools. And so that's one way that I think about how CRT can inform educational policy, particularly in relation to standardization and achievements on standardized benchmarks, is that it's a very narrow focus that's not at all considering the larger structures in society that continue to contribute to disadvantage for students of color. And so we can't hope to solve these problems without this multifaceted understanding and approach to the educational challenges that have been set before students and communities of color.
Let me do and I love that response, and I think you're right. We can't look at educational policy outside of what critical race theory tells us is important. Let me do a critical race reading of educational policy. What critical race theory would say about educational policy, one, is that it's not racially neutral. That racially it privileges, a set of groups and it disadvantages other groups. And so the one question is, how does the current policies that we have privilege some and marginalize others? Right? And we can begin to see that educational policy and literacy have long privileged, middle-class whites, because it in some ways not only inscribes but reinforces their literacy practices, their cultural practices, their values, beliefs, and dispositions, whereby these things become like normalized or invisible to the rest of the culture. So if you don't speak a certain language, say standard English, or if you don't write in particular ways, let's say the logocentric argument, your ability to read and write, gets penalized. And that the punitive, consequences that, are involved in education becomes racialized, based on a critical race theory reading. Another thing that we can begin to see outside of, the privilege of some are, microaggressions that when, these reform issues, are materialized within education situations. You have students who believe that they are not as educated or not as smart as other students, and so these, psychic beliefs that feed into like this internalized oppression also, bear certain types of bruises. So certain students go to school where, the schools are under tremendous pressure to, perform. We have teacher anxiety and other things which create, these really small, almost invisible experiences that the students who go to those schools every day experience. And this is a form of structural racism that influences the educational outcomes of those students, right? Because of the hostile environments that we've created through policy that these students must endure. It's another issue. And another issue, and I'll leave this at the last issue, is a form of internalized racism, right? This idea, let's say we got a group of, young students, men and women, who every day on the block, read and write, yet in ways that don't show up in school. Through hip-hop or through graffiti or through spoken word poems. And they go to school and they try to share these items, yet these items aren't don't necessarily find place or purchase within the school setting. We have a system, that has, in a sense, created a barrier to how they perform and how they do and how they think, and that barrier, has other kind of consequences when it comes to education. So just when we begin to think about reform from a critical race perspective, that reform is not racially neutral. In fact, that reform, because of the presence and the pervasiveness of racism within American society will privilege some and will marginalize others on the basis of race.
Alina, Judd, anything to add? Thank you, David and Allison.
I would say just in my work is conversations around these kind of ideas with primarily white pre-service teachers. One of the things I found very useful, to call back to what David was just saying, is the distinction between schooling and education. Right? Every kid shows up extremely well educated in a whole range of subjects. Now, a very narrow band of that is included or thought about or significant in a school setting. So in distinguishing between schooling and education, we start to call on those ideas about funds of knowledge and where students come from, their own counter narratives, how they speak back to the master narrative. I found that to be a useful way to engage pre-service teachers along those lines.
I think I keep thinking back to Derek Bell's work and his explanation of interest convergence, and thinking with your policy question politically about the ways in which legal attention is paid to the ways in which segregation and desegregation are structured and systemically maintained. And I think here, especially in the context of the South, we see that it's a segregation is still such a prominent and numeric and quantifiable and obvious injustice. I mean, it's just so clear and so obvious. And so I think for policy conversations, I'm very interested in the ways in which critical race theory can impact people who are bringing forth evidence to challenge and say that legal measures are only are a nice showing of the ways in which privileged people in political power can maintain an air or a facade of racial tolerance when in fact there is no such thing in this nation or currently. And so I think the old adage, like, if you're not pissed off, you're not paying attention, or if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention, is very much something that comes to mind when I think about the challenges ahead of us. With I was like a couple of months ago, I was in John Cornyn's. Do you guys know who John Cornyn is? He's a senator in Texas, and we went to his office to talk about national writing projects, and he said. His people said, "Oh, we don't believe in public education. Like, what are you talking about? Raising money for public education?" And so I think what is so daunting and so bizarre in the ways in which our legal system and the ways in which our educational system is so that is so fundamentally racist in its composition, that it seems that we must move forward in a way that's extremely radical. And I often wonder about this issue when people are talking about civil rights in terms of a functionalist democracy, where education works for certain people and absolutely has abandoned and does not work. And in fact segregates, marginalizes, oppresses, silences most groups of people, that often calls for very radical differences in the ways power is distributed. So it's a tough question. I don't know.
And it's it's a large umbrella, so you might be working in different methodologies, or in the classroom spaces, or in the teacher education spaces, or the ed policy spaces. So it's when we look at it as kind of an ontological lens.
Right.
So let's bring that lens now to research. How do we use critical race theory or CRT when we're researching literacies and the practice of literacy?
Well, Greg, you mentioned, this connection, or this potential connection or possibility between other literacies and a range of literacies, and David, you spoke explicitly to that as well. That I think is important for thinking about how we take up privilege, but also integrate critical race theory and racial literacies, if you will, into studying literacy practices. So thinking about how the literacies that young people or that people themselves enact, how people make and communicate meaning, is essentially informed by race and how they understand their world, how they live their lives. And so I don't think that there is any sort of artificial separation between the racialized knowledge and understandings and meaning-making practices that people have, and the other kinds of literacies that that they enact and that they use to make meaning. So one book that I really love is Valerie Kinloch's work, Harlem on Our Minds. And she looks at the literacy practices of two young black males in particular, concerned about gentrification of their Harlem communities, and looks at how they engage multiple literacies in thinking about this issue and inquiring into it, and then also how their classroom teacher creates some space for them to bring their reading, their thinking, their writing about these topics, into the classroom. And so I think there is this theoretical and also just kind of practical intersection of the literacy practices that people engage. And so I think, again, being open to noticing those connections and privileging race and racial literacies in our work is vital to kind of exploring these connections more and seeing what they're able to teach us about how we can better understand young people's literacy practices and how we can take up racial literacies and racial perspectives in academic work in schools. Particularly in the study of literature, I think we talked about this a little bit as well. There are different interpretative strategies that we talk about for reading literature, for understanding literary works. Certainly, a racial lens, a racial perspective is a key way for reading and understanding and crafting responses to literature. So I think we already have some really promising theoretical and conceptual connections there for doing some of this work in literacy research. Now, let others elaborate on that as well.
Yeah, it's almost like we're talking about being civic and community ready, not really college and career ready. It's it's get our sense of agency and identity in place, and there's an active element, a sense of making and being, and identity work.
Well, I think critical race theory work is important for being civically ready, but I think it can be important too, to begin to interrogate, discourses of work as well as, discourses for college readiness. I think we have too often, associated work and college readiness, with some of the grand narratives, around work and college readiness that they're associated with dominant culture, and that's problematic. And I think some of the work in terms of research, to get back to your original question, Greg, is that some of the work that needs to be done is we need to begin to ask questions and unpack and interrupt, these larger discourses that, consults to create like the space where work in college, is associated with dominant culture. And just, again, in terms of research, I think critical race theory gives us a set of new questions for literacy. One is, how does race and racism, more explicitly, work in ways that we understand race? So this question would be, how are literacy practices or literacies, always racial practices as well, or always have racial identities? I don't think we've answered that question well, and I don't think we've answered that question, enough. We haven't answered the question, about the consequences of, literacy as a racialized practice when it comes to achievement, when it comes to work, when it comes to college entrance. I think we can answer those questions. It gives us new forms of data to begin to look at. And so data collection, We begin to, collect data from the skin, like the body and the flesh and its brownness or its blackness or its, whatever tint or tangent it has become meaningful. And these things begin to, bear, meaning, as we begin to collect and understand. It gives us different ways to analyze and different things to analyze. But for me, one thing that critical race theory has given me is a different way to write my research. I don't have to write necessarily, in the dominant way of writing where my audience becomes, a group of, 4 or 5 people. When I'm playing with Foucault's politics of representation, now I can write to a wider audience using a different type of genre, and that genre being, a type of storytelling, a type of narrativizing that critical race theory privileges.
I think that's a key piece when we talk about research. It's not just the content of the research that has to be addressed, is the methods of the research. It's not just knowledge, it's the way knowledge is created or knowledges are created. Like those are the tools that we need in research to reach out and develop new tools for new forms of knowledge.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. We have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to hand it off to Kathy, who will serve as our kind of facilitator, since we're not going to not so much as a discussant role. But I just want to thank everybody for joining us and for especially opening my eyes and letting me kind of learn with everybody. So if you have any thoughts that you want to close us out with, Kathy, please jump in.
Sure, and maybe even, I don't want to presume to put words into people's mouths, but it seems like we organized our talk into 3 segments. One was about definitions, one was about practice, and the last one was about research. So folks talked about theorizing critical race theory to attend to the complexities of the ways that racism manifests itself and is experienced in society, and how it's different from earlier perspectives where we talked about sort of the pluralistic approach of multicultural education and even culturally responsive teaching. It's something that is more about not deleting race from the conversation instead of homogenizing it and having it disappear and then sort of still exist in ways that don't get talked about. So the focus is on race and the power that's constructed in relation to race and various components of society, and then figuring out ways to invite counter-narratives that allow us to take apart the master narratives. Judd gave us a little bit of the history along the way. I think David and Allison both helped us with the nuances of the definitions, and Alina talked about how she was applying the work to her observations and work in elementary classrooms. One of the things Alina said about critical race theory being a framework that invites us to invite the counter-narrative into our lives and to take on white supremacy and daily microaggressions. To get ready for the session, I was listening to the video that Gloria Ladson-Billings made, I think at North Carolina, Asheville maybe? Somebody
yes, that's right.
Bibliography, right. And so that, and I've heard her use this phrase before, that notion of 1,000 cuts that people go through. Different people in our society experience those cuts in different ways, and it's really important. Allison, you wrote about this in your notes for the session, and it didn't come out in the conversation as much, but it's the understanding how all people experience those things. Even those freshmen we have in class who are shocked and horrified when they realize just how colorblind they've been, right? And they confront that for the first time in their lives. The kids of color who are freshmen in classes who've, been in schools that privilege certain kind of traditional notions of literacy, and they've bought into it. So, I mean, there's you can't even essentialize who it is you think you're addressing in a freshman class. Just build spaces to invite those counter narratives and invite people to realize just how oppressive the master narrative is, I think, along the way. A question that I have about that discussion is related to, and it's sort of a rhetorical question that we're probably not going to have time to talk about, but there is that business of how hard it is to be heard in introducing sort of a racialized perspective to often colorblind individuals or people who are struggling with, well, how does this position me and what do I want to do about it? And they're kind of working it through, so they don't just see it as, oh, that's your agenda because you're a college professor, or worse, that's your agenda because you're a person of color who's a college professor. You know, I mean, there's that whole like thing that students have to sort through that I think is we're still in the middle of figuring out how to even do that in our classes along the way, and to invite new assistant professors into figuring out ways of doing it. I also think that in that same regard, we're in the beginning stages of, we often talk with each other about how important the counter narratives of youth of color are, and then how do we get those, how kids really feel who are from all different kinds of background to bring their narratives to the table as they're realizing that they're colorblind in the society, is sort of a thing that I worry about in our old classroom. It's just important for, you know, so most of our schools are segregated. Most of the kids of color in our schools are going to segregated schools. Well, most of the kids who don't call themselves or recognize themselves as kids of color are also going to segregated schools, and there's narratives to be deconstructed and explored and studied in those contexts as well. And you sort of wonder, how do we get some cross-pollination across those narratives so that people can learn from each other? And I'm not arguing for multiculturalism. I'm arguing for something bigger and more radical that deconstructs those barriers along the way. That idea, too, of what's happening in the research, I mean, people are starting to explore what's needed to invite kids' notions of how the world works and their counter narratives into the classroom. That's really important work that needs to continue, and needs to continue for all the people who attend our schools, even as we're saying, and so just what are these neoliberal agendas and who are they privileging, and why are they getting set in the way that they are, and how did it happen so quickly? And it really must be one major agenda that is to be taken on and critiqued if it could happen so quickly and silence so many people in the process along the way. It's kind of a scary moment where we are right now. What do we do next was the other thing you folks asked me to talk about. You know, I look for spaces, well, first of all, I look for spaces where I can critique myself, which I think is what we're always in the middle of doing, even as we're inviting new teachers and kids in our classroom to look to themselves first and then figure out how it is they're constructing themselves in relation to something they might call other, right? And we look at that in really close and careful ways. We could look at Literacy Research Association as an organization and think about how we deconstruct that. I mean, there's like all these different hierarchies that we all belong to that help to define who we are, but right now there's like lots of other people who are doing 1,000, who are, it's making 1,000 cuts again. Lots of folks' perspectives who might be interested in figuring out how to privilege the counter narratives. I keep looking too and thinking, okay, so if a first move starts with me looking at myself, how do I form study groups where I read the materials in the bibliographies that you've put together for this session, and everything else that can come along the way that teaches me different ways of seeing how people are oppressing each other in the world. And then I start looking at the pedagogical suggestions, and then I start exploring them and having other folks observe my teaching and inviting us to critique each other in a sort of safe space so that we can continue to keep moving forward. But that's like a small thing that I can do. With the taking on the policy implications, that's a huge question that I think we probably need to have some larger discussions on. I apologize if I put words in anybody's mouth and want to see if anyone wants to say any last word to correct it before they take us off the air here.
I want to put in one little plug. LRA has a critical race theory study group that I've been a part of for going on 7 or 8 years. I know it's been active for about 9 or 10. We have wonderful sessions that are both critical of ourselves, but also we have a community to be critical, with each other, to hear those stories, to hear those, and to engage in conversations around what does this look like in literacy research. So I'm sure Florida, noon, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we'll be there ready to go. So.
All right. If there's no final words from anyone else, I'm gonna close out the show. Thank you guys so much, and I invite the audience and any of the panelists to join us for the follow-up Twitter chat on the 17th at 8 o'clock using the hashtag literacies. And we'll be using the same kind of questions that we framed today's show. It's kind of a wrap-up show. We've been trying to do these month-long topical studies within the Research to Practice show, and we hope in the future to expand them to include different kind of book talks or article reads. But for now, we have one Twitter chat followed by the live Research to Practice show, and then a follow-up Twitter chat on the next Thursday following this show. So thank you to a wonderful panelists, and I hope to see you all in your work and in person, so in both our digital spaces and our meet spaces. So thank you, everybody, and Mike, you can wrap us up. And thank you, Mike.